Welcome to Lecture 12. Lecture 12 is based on Chapter 12 of your textbook, and it is the third module of, or the third section of Module 3. And it deals with qualitative data presentation. Up until this time in your textbook or in your course, we haven't dealt too much with qualitative data research, its presentation. And there are several reasons for this. One of the many reasons is that qualitative research itself is performed and conducted by different researchers in very, very different ways. So there don't exist too many common threads. The steps in order to conduct research you have been exposed to, but we haven't picked up any tangible examples for qualitative research and how one might conduct it. So this is really the most exposure you will have to both collecting data and qualitative research and how that data might be interpreted, analyzed, and presented. There are many techniques that we use in qualitative research to collect data. Observation is a technique that's used. It's a basic qualitative research technique, and it can be of two types. It can be a non-participant and a participant. What that means is, hypothetically, if you are hoping to assume qualitative data, say from a rock concert, and you decide that you want to participate in the rock concert as an attendee so that not only can you observe what's going on and ask questions of the attendees, you can also experience what it feels like, perhaps to have a certain piece of music played, or the enthusiasm in the crowd, the energy, and any of the other phenomena that you might choose to immerse yourself in. Okay, so that is what is considered a participant observer. So while you are observing and making mental notes, or perhaps have a way of recording your observations in a handheld tape recorder, whatever be the case, that would be a participant observer. You could also be a non-participant observer, which means rather than attend the rock concert yourself, you make use of the many security video cameras that are available, of course, both of these subject to ethical approval by your research and ethics board, and with permission from the respective facilities and so on. And you observe behaviors, but not completely participating in it. There are benefits to either process, and there is obviously the risk to the researcher is somewhat limited in a non-participant observation scenario, and it is a different situation when they are a participant. For example, if a researcher wants to study the phenomena of riots and the moods, that's a risky situation to be in. There are three things that you look for in an observation-based research and qualitative study. The big picture, or the whole situation, is one of the things. So this is the big pic. So always be mindful of what is going on. What's the mood? What's the tone? If you're at a rock concert, are people deflated, or are they excited? Are they annoyed? Perhaps there's a delay with the musicians coming on board. What's the whole situation? And the examples provided here are perhaps in a meeting it's aggressive, conciliatory, or defensive. Then, after looking at the big picture, look at the participants. So obviously, if it's a big crowd, it's hard to identify participants. But perhaps a few participants representing different opportunities for observation might present themselves, or maybe the researcher wishes to look at one type or one set of participants. So after observing the big picture, different participants can be observed for themselves. And in this case, it's in a committee meeting, you have different factions who are being observed, who are expressing different points of view. At a rock concert, there might be different kinds of people. There might be a group come with family members. There might be a bunch of young women alone. There might be a bunch of young men. There might be a rowdy group who is very loud. Different groups, right? And then, So you observe the big picture, you observe participants or groups of participants, and then what the researcher perceives given his own preconceptions. We all come in with preconceptions, right? So what we consider as our preconceptions and values, say for example, we notice some people throwing one of the members in their group up into the air and grabbing them. It might be very rowdy behavior or risky behavior for some of you and for some of us, and that's based on a value judgment that we have. The same goes for if we see at a rock concert a bunch of people inhaling some sort of psychoactive substance. In our perception, that might be risky or dangerous behavior, and so on. So it's we have to pay attention to what we perceive, and based on our values. It's true whether it's a rock concert, whether it's a committee, and it's important in an observation to be aware of how we perceive it and appreciate the event compared to what somewhat, because it's not completely objective, a somewhat more objective situation might be documented. So continuing with examples, when we note down our examples of situations, what we observe, for example, if we notice at a rock concert, a group of 4, 2 men, 2 women, 2 women, 2 men, consuming cocaine. Impression and thought. They appear to be addicts. Their physical appearance and dishevelment indicates that they engage in this sort of activity regularly. Now keep in mind, your reaction thoughts are everything that comes to your mind when you observe this. The observation tends to be very objective. Similarly, if you see, 2 people jumped the line when purchasing tickets. Now, your observation to that might be these 2 people appear to be very entitled. They seem to believe that the line didn't hold any value for them. They were a little aggressive and loud, and they decided to make their way forward, or whatever it is that you wish to write. So it's a good idea to be able to put your own thoughts adjacent to the observations, because that forms a framework. It frames the incidents that occur within your own mental construct or your own framework. There's another example. It's a code book where they're looking at racialization, immigration to Winnipeg, and one of the authors of your textbook actually did a research looking at employment situation amongst racialized youth in Winnipeg. And this is an example of where they do some thematic analysis. So at this point, we've gone past, we're done with the observation method of collecting data and presenting data. Well, we'll talk about presenting in a little bit more, but let's finish up with collecting and analyzing data itself. Thematic analysis, as you remember, can be done with transcripts of interviews, interviews themselves, videotapes of interviews, films, so many different things. Okay, so in this example, they are talking about the use of the transcripts of an interview, and they're identifying themes. So under the theme looking for employment, there are several sub-themes. So they talk about racial discrimination, they're looking for language barriers, they're looking for age discrimination, prior work experience. Then they have a second theme, social networks, and they talk about different. So this page that you have, this is identifying themes and sub-themes from simply one interview. And as you notice, the topics of racial discrimination comes and it identifies where this is. Interview number 1, page 4, interview number. So sorry, my apologies. This is multiple interviews. But as they're looking at multiple interviews, they start to populate this page. And you see racial discrimination show up in the first interview, the 8th interview, and they identify where it is. Interview 17, interview 6, interview 10, and they put a numerical count to how many times the theme showed up. Now, keep in mind with thematic analysis, there are different ways to do it. It can occupy quantitative, I call it a quasi-quantitative route because it's not, the quantity is not representative of the import that it may have in the interviewer's life. And if we do decide that it does have importance, it needs to be verified by discussing that with the interviewee again. In any case, there's a quantitative measure put here. And the idea is that you code for all of these different themes, you see the frequency that they occur, and then you try to go back to these interviews or to the interviewees and try to figure out the importance of all of these different themes in their life to actually make the framework to do your analysis. So framework is a key idea, key concept in qualitative research. While we are interested in the individual narrative, the narrative and the themes identified from the narrative as being important to the individual are enriched or are of considerably more value when there is a framework within which it is set up so that it's recognized that under this framework, all of these experiences, all of these understandings, all of these worldviews make sense. Okay? So one of the things that is spoken about in in chapter 12 is an actions framework. It's an analytical approach, and the descriptions here, I'm not going to read this out to you, but the idea is people construct their lives as with what they have as typical actions, and it's done because they view social structures around them a certain way. So these are called an actions framework. So what that means is, and in this example, they talk about Muslims greeting each other with salam alaikum and wa alaikum assalam, or wearing the qamis or hijabs in terms of clothing. Now, all of this makes sense and is absolutely in place to a Muslim person. It makes complete sense to greet somebody else with a salam or salam alaikum, or respond with wa alaikum assalam. Or, for example, for a Muslim woman to wear a hijab while going out, that's the normal. That's where they operate from. And when I say every individual has a framework, and each individual operates with their understanding of how the framework is situated around them. So that's called an actions framework. Now, beyond an actions framework, which frames every individual's actions, behaviors, choices, there is also a cultural framework. For example, if you have 100 people who follow Islam, most of them or all of them are likely to greet each other with similar terms, dress a certain way, and so on. And it goes beyond the individual. It's the whole culture defining what people do in a cultural framework. A cultural framework example in Canada is think of typical actions Canadians do. People walking across the street, they may not know each other, but especially in smaller towns like Sudbury, the cultural framework supports the idea that people will greet each other. If you're walking a dog, someone else is walking a dog. Typically, people will greet each other, say hello, and exchange some politeness about their companion animals. People are always, when in the supermarket, if we accidentally cut somebody off, we apologize. These are all, and you can think of several such actions. So that is the cultural framework for Canada. Or at least that gives you a sense for the cultural framework. Now, within cultural frameworks, there are several subsets and subsections, and we all have our own little niche or collection of things that we use to frame our understanding of our world around us. But the cultural framework is a broader set that defines a larger population. And typical actions framework can be either part of a cultural framework or can be the cultural framework itself. I think that's pretty much what we have for this lecture. So go ahead, read chapter 12, try to answer the questions in the back, and complete all the exercises in your study guide if you haven't done so already. All right. We will talk to you in lecture 13, and that will be the last lecture for this course. So see you soon. Bye.